Hey everyone, ready to dive deep into Rich Dad, Poor Dad?
Oh, yeah. This one's a classic.
It really is. I remember the first time I read it, kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some traditional thinking around money, doesn't it?
Big time.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's stuck around for so long. It keeps people talking. So for our listeners who maybe haven't cracked it open yet, what would you say is the core idea Kiyosaki's getting at?
Well, he starts off with this whole two dads thing, right? His own dad, super educated but not really wealthy, and then his friend's dad, the rich dad, who's a self-made business owner.
Okay, so two totally different perspectives on money.
Exactly. And Kiyosaki learned from both of them, but it's the rich dad's lessons that really form the backbone of the book. Like, for example, the way they each view a house.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. I remember being totally thrown off by that the first time I read it.
Right, because like most people think house equals asset, right? The American dream and all that.
For sure, home ownership. That's what we're all taught.
But Kiyosaki flips the script. He says, hang on, a house is a liability.
Whoa, hold up. How's a house a liability? It's got to be worth something, right?
Well, it's not about the value necessarily. It's about the cash flow. Kiyosaki says if something's taking money out of your pocket each month, like mortgage payments, repairs, property taxes, that's a liability, even if it looks like a valuable asset.
So it's not about what you own, but how that ownership affects your money coming in versus going out.
Bingo. That's a big mindset shift right there. And it sets the stage for some of the rich dad's other unconventional wisdom. Like one of my favorites, work to learn, don't work for money.
Now, I know we all got to get that paycheck, but what's he really saying there?
He's saying even in a regular job, think about the skills you're gaining that could help you build wealth later.
Almost like having that side hustle mentality, even if you're still 9 to 5.
Exactly. Always be learning, even if it's not directly making you rich right now. Another one that kind of goes with that is mind your own business.
Which doesn't mean be rude to your boss, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. It means focus on building your own asset column, separate from your job, stuff that generates income for you.
So that ties back to the whole assets versus liabilities thing.
Mm-hmm.
Kiyosaki makes those definitions seem so simple, but they really change the way you look at things.
Definitely. An asset puts money in your pocket, a liability takes it out. Simple, but powerful.
So, like, that new car everyone's impressed by could be a liability if you're still making payments on it. But that little rental property nobody sees, that could be a cash flow asset.
See, you're getting it. And even small everyday things can fall into this. Think about your spending habits. That daily latte, is that a little treat or a tiny liability chipping away at your goals?
Oof, gotta rethink my coffee budget now.
The point is to start analyzing your choices through this lens, What do you own right now that could be shifted to the asset side?
Now, one part of Rich Dad, Poor Dad that always gets people riled up is when Kiyosaki talks about corporations.
Yeah, that's where he gets a little controversial. His argument is that the rich use corporations to their advantage, minimizing taxes in ways employees can't.
Right, and he uses that whole Robin Hood analogy, saying the rich avoid a tax burden that ends up falling on the middle class.
It's definitely a statement, and I know it's caused a lot of debate.
But just so everyone's clear, we're not giving tax evasion advice here, right? We're just breaking down what the book says.
Absolutely. It's crucial to get legal and ethical financial advice that's right for your situation.
But I do think it's helpful to hear these different perspectives, even if you don't agree with everything. Makes you think critically about the system.
No doubt. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Two dads, assets versus liabilities, corporations. But Kiyosaki doesn't just stop at the money stuff, does he?
No, he gets into the mental game too. All those inner hurdles that can hold us back.
Right. He calls them the 5 enemies to success. Fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, arrogance.
We've all got at least one of those lurking around, I'm sure.
Probably more than we'd like to admit. But take fear, for instance. Kiyosaki tells this great story about remembering the Alamo, turning fear into motivation.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Using fear as fuel instead of letting it paralyze you.
It's powerful stuff. Do you find that resonates with you?
Totally. I think we all have fears that can hold us back, and learning how to reframe them can be a game changer.
It's all about seeing obstacles as opportunities for growth. And Kiyosaki's point is that mindset is just as important as any financial strategy.
Totally. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you're constantly battling fear or cynicism, it's going to be tough to actually reach your goals.
Which is why he emphasizes taking action, right? Don't just think about money differently, actually do something about it.
And that's where his to-do list comes in. Practical steps to start building wealth, even if you're not starting from a position of privilege.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be diving into next, the practical side of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Moving from concepts to concrete actions. All right, so we've talked about mindset, we've talked about those big picture ideas from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but Kiyosaki doesn't just leave us hanging with theory, right? He actually gives us stuff to do.
Yeah, that's what I appreciate about the book. It's not just like think different. It's like, okay, here's how to actually start changing your financial life. And one of the first things he talks about is finding mentors, but not just like your buddies who complain about being broke.
Right. It's going to be more strategic than that. He's talking about finding people who are already successful in the areas you want to grow in, people who can give you real guidance, not just commiserate with you.
I mean, think about it. If you want to get into real estate investing, you're not going to learn much from your friend who's just as clueless as you are. You want to learn from someone who's actually doing it right.
Exactly. It's about finding people who've already walked the path you want to walk. And another thing Kiyosaki stresses is mastering one financial formula before moving on to the next.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because it's easy to get overwhelmed when you're first starting out, right? There's so much information out there.
Oh, for sure. Information overload is a real thing. So Kiyosaki's advice is to go deep, not wide. Find a strategy that resonates with you, really understand it inside and out, and then you can expand your knowledge.
So, like, if you're interested in real estate, maybe focus on learning all the nuances of being a landlord, like rental properties, before you jump into flipping houses or something more complex.
Right. Build that solid foundation first. Don't try to do everything at once. And this ties into another one of his big points. Pay yourself first.
Okay, I gotta admit, this one always sounded kind of weird to me. Like, shouldn't you pay your bills first? How can you pay yourself when you're already stretched thin?
Well, what Kiyosaki's getting at is that you should prioritize your own financial well-being. Set aside a portion of your income for savings and investments before you do anything else.
So even before the rent check or the credit card bill, you're putting a chunk of money aside.
Exactly. Building that wealth-generating machine, even if it starts small. It's a habit, you know?
I guess it's kind of like saying, my future self is the most important creditor.
That's a great way to put it. And, you know, Rich Dad, Poor Dad obviously has its critics. Some people think it's too simplistic or whatever. But one thing I think everyone can agree on is that it really forces you to examine your own relationship with money.
Totally. It's not just a financial guide. It's almost like a self-help book for your money mindset. Makes you question all those assumptions we pick up about wealth and success.
Yeah, and it really challenges that whole traditional path, right? Go to school, get a job, work hard, hope for the best. Kiyosaki's like, nope, there's another way.
He really pushes you to think outside the box, to consider alternative paths to financial freedom, to take control, you know.
And that's not just about getting rich for the sake of it. It's about having the time and resources to do what you actually want to do. Pursue your passions, spend time with loved ones, whatever that looks like for you.
Which kind of brings us to something Kiyosaki talks about that I think is super interesting and maybe doesn't get talked about enough. That whole idea of finding your path.
Yeah, it's not just about a job or a career. It's bigger than that. It's about figuring out what you're really here to do, what makes you tick.
And he doesn't necessarily lay out a step-by-step plan for how to do that, but he stresses the importance of it. And I think that's really powerful.
It is. It's about aligning your actions with your values, right? Connecting your financial goals with your overall sense of purpose. Which, I guess, leads us to a pretty big question for our listeners. So, after all this talk about Rich Dad, Poor Dad, after really digging into it, has it got you thinking about your own path? What gets you fired up?
You know, I was thinking about that while you were talking. It's kind of like, he's not saying quit your job tomorrow and become an entrepreneur, but he is saying figure out what lights you up and see if there's a way to, I don't know, make it more than just a hobby, right?
Yeah. It's about connecting your passions to your financial goals. Like maybe there's a side hustle in there somewhere. Or maybe it even inspires a bigger career shift down the line.
That's the cool thing about this book. It can be applied at any stage, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're just starting out or you're already well into your career.
For sure. I mean, I reread Rich Dad, Poor Dad every few years, and I always get something new out of it. It's like, it meets you where you're at.
And it pushes you to keep growing, keep learning. It's not just a one-time read. It's a philosophy almost.
I like that, a philosophy. And one that can be, you know, kind of controversial at times.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Not everyone agrees with everything Kiyosaki says.
Right. But even if you don't agree with every single point, I think there's value in just having your beliefs challenged a little bit.
Totally. It makes you think critically, Do your own research. Figure out what works for you.
Exactly. It's not about blindly following anyone's advice. It's about becoming financially literate, taking control of your own destiny.
And ultimately, I think that's what Kiyosaki's really advocating for, right? Empowerment. The power to design a life you love.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So we've come to the end of our deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and man, there's a lot to chew on here, right?
For sure. It's a thought-provoking book, and it's one that I think everyone should read at least once, even if just to see what all the fuss is about.
Totally agree. And hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners some new insights, some things to ponder as they continue on their own financial journeys.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. Keep learning, keep growing, keep those Rich Dad lessons in mind.
Well said.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.